When you think about home healthcare, I think one of the most important sort of backbones to your program is going to be understanding what the collateral standard to the electrical safety, the 60601 standard, the dash one dash 11 collateral standard, the home healthcare standard is most important. So I know that you've studied that. I've studied that. They basically take the 60601 standard that is challenging to meet for certain products. And they say, oh, you want to put it on a table with a child who has a glass of orange juice next to it. Okay. You're going to have to design it to a completely different level of safety, mechanical, electrical safety. I guess in your experience, Rachel, like what are some of the challenges with designing to the dash one dash 11 collateral standard, the one that's more specific to home healthcare usage?
Yeah, it definitely constrains you in, several areas. On the electrical safety side, for example, it's very particular about, you've moved into this uncontrolled environment. You're now in people's apartments or homes that could be 150-year-old, Baltimore City townhomes, or could be, really nice, brand new, rebuilt, remodeled homes with, 21st century best electrical wiring you could ever get. But the home healthcare standard has to assume that you don't have that. So it kind of puts constraints on your electrical safety design, which really can dictate your entire system level design. For example, earth ground is a common tool of protecting the user. You can't assume that in a home healthcare device. So that can really change your entire, you know, system architecture from the get-go. So that's a challenge, and that kind of boxes you in a little bit there. EMC and radiation and things like that are more stringent because again, they can't restrict what you bring into your 10-year-old brings in from a new toy they got at school, and what it's doing and what it's radiating. They can't control that like they can in a clinician's office. So they really have to, your device takes on that responsibility. So there's some specific standards, but also in terms of, physical dropping, whether it's body worn, whether or not your child has a glass of orange juice or really likes to throw, fluid at, as many objects as they can. Those are all considerations now that the standard is trying to grapple with in the kind of the extremeness of the environment. Also, do you live in San Diego or do you live in Baltimore? Which honestly, we get such extreme, or not the most extreme, but pretty extreme weather here. How do you know where the person's storing this? Are they putting it in their attic in 100-degree summer? Or are they putting it in their basement in, Antarctica? Probably not, but you never know. So it's like there's just the home healthcare standard is really kind of trying to grapple with that. And so by doing that, it puts more constraints on, temperature, mechanical stress, electrical safety. And so it requires you to think early and kind of plan for that in your architecture. I'd say mostly in the electrical safety is where it has the biggest impact if you were to try move to a clinical device or a in-home device later in life.
Yeah, I just took a look at the collateral standard before this meeting because I love reading safety standards. Um, and I saw that, essential performance, right? That's the key requirement to meet after every one of these tests. Does your product meet essential performance? And I saw one that was interesting, stuck out to me, which was you have to maintain essential performance after the loss of power. Is that something that you've had to design for?
It is something we've considered. It depends on what your device is trying to accomplish. It depends on the severity of what your device is doing. So if you are a respiratory device, obviously you have to maintain functionality after loss of power. In other devices, you could claim that it depends on your definition of essential performance, but you can claim that it's not a critical, use when you lose power. But a lot of devices, have to have backup power, or they have to have means of surviving for several minutes after something has powered off. So that's something we have definitely considered in some of the more intensive in-home devices we've been looking at architecting, but it's not always required.
Yeah. Gotcha. Yeah, there's at least 10 other examples like that where
Yeah,
it's up to your interpretation, right, of the risk to the patient and how you can justify these different scenarios.
yeah.
So here's another theme that I was thinking about before this podcast, which is, home healthcare. The home is the ultimate use environment for these products that are being designed. But as we said earlier, a lot of times in my program, which was a body worn monitor and on the project that you were working on, a therapeutic, actually, you really have to think creatively about how you're going to design these programs to get the clinical data you're looking for in a clinic to prove the therapy works. And then after you've proven it works, then you're designing for the home environment. So it's kind of hacking the product development life cycle in medical devices, designing something for a clinical trial, and then very quickly, updating it for home use. So my question for you is, how do you design, or what do you think about when you're designing a device that ultimately would be used in a home environment, but initially needs to be designed for a clinic? How are you thinking like a platform, but it's being designed for a clinic first?
Yeah, and that's a real challenge. I will say there you can approach it 2 ways. You can approach it by going to a clinic and doing clinical data, and that's often required if you have a high safety or high risk device. You need to get that clinic because you have in a home, you have uncontrolled and you have untrained users. Uncontrolled environment and untrained users. In clinic, you need to get one of those back. So normally you need some sort of oversight. So in terms of designing a device intended for the clinic, but with home use, what you wanna do is you wanna get off the get-go with your in-home, 60601-1-11 medical standard. You wanna design your electrical safety and things like that for the home, because that is hard to undo later or to redo with small changes. It can require a completely different device, um, if you kind of build for clinic and then to build for device later. Oftentimes, that's what you need if you're in early feasibility trying to understand what this technology can even do. You don't wanna over-constrain yourself in a clinic device, so you want the flexibility. So sometimes it makes sense to divide a device for the clinic as like a prototyping device, and then with real purpose, move to a in-home device later. But we have done it the other way too, where we designed a device to actually do clinical trials in the home. That has a lot of challenges associated with it because you now don't have oversight. So you also have to interpret your data with the thought of, is my user using it correctly? So it becomes an additional challenge of how do you collect this data and know that you're getting real data. But that is, for less high risk devices, something that you can prove to the FDA is relatively safe, and that you can prove to yourself that someone messing it up won't affect your efficacy results. That's another approach, is to go straight to the home, but it is a challenge, so you really have to be prepared to kind of get that connectivity and get data back, and really think about structuring your clinical trial from a home interface early.
Yep. No, I definitely agree with designing the electrical architecture for the finished product for sure. Software is probably in that category too.
Yeah,
I think where you want to put all the hooks in place for designing for the ultimate product, but maybe not actually populate everything
and
for your trial device.
that can be an additional challenge when you're early and trying to understand how your technology when you're proving a technology, how you can kind of build in how that the science works in a lab versus in a home or in a clinic. It can be really challenging to constrain yourself to an in-home environment early. So sometimes you make the leap and you get the clinical data with a different device.
What are some of the ways that you've incorporated, or I guess met the increased electrical safety requirements put on you by the -1-11 collateral standard? What are some of the practices that you employ?
A couple of things is the 60601-11 standard or -1-11 standard just constrains you in where you have to begin. So if you're starting from scratch, it does limit you. You have to be very careful about meeting means of protection for your patients. That's true of all 60601, but what 60601-1-11 does is it constrains you in how you're allowed to do that. So it can end up having a pretty big impact in how you architect your electronics because you don't have the ability to assume a good earth ground system. You have to design substantially more encrypted clearances, etc. For another example is, maybe you have a device where you need a simple kind of power plug-in, but how do you ensure that someone doesn't plug in the wrong power cable into your system and, destroy your system? So, it might be you could throw a lockout so that it doesn't turn on if the user puts in the right thing, or more smartly, you design it to accept a wider range of inputs to kind of avoid that error altogether. So those are kind of some examples. On EMC, it's about picking components that are, pre-certified to those specific home healthcare standards. If you can do that, that definitely is a little bit limiting, but it'll save you headache in the long run. So that's very helpful as well.